Right now, Police Commissioner James O'Neill is making an announcement about Officer Daniel Panteleo, who has been accused in the chokehold death of Eric Garner. Let's listen in.
He was accused of violating NYPD policy while helping effect the lawful arrest of Eric Garner in Staten Island on July 17, 2014. It is a decision that necessarily requires fairness and impartiality for Mr. Garner, who died following that encounter with police. It is also a decision that requires fairness and impartiality for Officer Pantaleo, who was sent by this department to assess the situation and take appropriate police action. First, I will discuss how I reached my decision, and then I will answer any questions you have on the topic. For some time prior to July 17, 2014, neighborhood residents purposely avoided the area in and directly around Tompkinsville Park in Staten Island. The conditions at that time arose from an array of criminal activity. Drug dealers worked the edges of the park, and across the street, selling narcotics. A handful of men regularly sold loose cigarettes made cheaper by the fact that New York State taxes had not been paid on them. A liquor store nearby sold alcohol to people who would drink that alcohol in the park. People who would sometimes use drugs, urinate, and pass out on benches there. That summer, the week before there had been reports of theft and 2 robberies in the park, there were 911, 311, and other complaints from residents and merchants on an ongoing basis. In some cases, warnings or summonses were issued. In other cases, arrests were made. And that was the situation at Tompkinsville Park on the day Officer Pantaleo was sent with another officer to conduct an enforcement operation. When the second officer observed Mr. Garner hand out cigarettes in exchange for money, they approached Mr. Garner to make an arrest. That offense could have resulted in a summons, but Mr. Garner refused to provide identification, which meant he would have been brought to the precinct for processing. For several minutes on that widely viewed video, Mr. Garner makes it abundantly clear that he will not go willingly with the police officers. He refused to cooperate with the arrest and to comply with lawful orders. The video also makes clear that Officer Pantaleo's original efforts to take Mr. Garner into custody were appropriate, and that he initially attempted 2 maneuvers sanctioned by the police department. Officer Pantaleo first grabbed Mr. Garner's right wrist and attempted an armbar technique in preparation for handcuffs to be used. Mr. Garner immediately twisted and pulled and raised both of his hands while repeatedly telling the officer to not touch him. Officer Pantaleo then wrapped his arms around Mr. Garner's upper body. Up to that point in this tense and rapidly evolving situation, there was nothing to suggest that Officer Pantaleo attempted to place Mr. Garner in a chokehold. But what happened next is the matter we must address. The 2 men stumbled backward towards the large plate glass window, the storefront behind them, and Officer Pantaleo's back made contact with the glass, causing the window to visibly buckle and warp. The person videotaping the episode later testified at the NYPD trial that he thought both men would crash through the glass. It is at that point in the video that Officer Pantaleo is seen with his hands clasped together and his left forearm pressed against Mr. Garner's neck in what constitutes a chokehold. The NYPD court ruled that while certainly not preferable, that hold was acceptable during that brief moment in time because the risk of falling through the window was so high. But that exigent circumstance no longer existed, the court found, when Officer Pantaleo and Mr. Garner moved to the ground. As Mr. Garner balanced himself on the sidewalk on his hands and knees, Deputy Commissioner of Trials Rosemarie Maldonado found that Officer Pantaleo consciously disregarded the substantial and unjustifiable risk of maneuver explicitly prohibited by the department. She found that during the struggle, Officer Pantaleo had the opportunity to readjust his grip from a prohibited chokehold to a less lethal alternative, but did not make use of that opportunity. Instead, even once Mr. Garner was moved to his side on the ground, with his left arm behind his back and his right hand still open and extended, Officer Pantaleo kept his hands clasped and maintained the chokehold. Mr. Garner's obvious distress is confirmed when he coughs and grimaces. Moreover, Trials Commissioner Maldonado found that Officer Pantaleo's conduct caused physical injury that meets the penal law threshold and that his recklessness caused multi-layered internal bruising and hemorrhaging that impaired Mr. Garner's physical condition and caused substantial pain and was a significant factor in triggering an asthma attack. For all of these reasons, taken together, even after reviewing Officer Pantaleo's commendable service record of nearly 300 arrests and 14 department medals earned leading up to that day, Trial Commissioner Maldonado recommended that he be dismissed from the department. In making this penalty recommendation, she wrote, this tribunal recognizes that from the outset, Mr. Garner was non-compliant, compliant, and argumentative, and further notes that the patrol guide allows officers to use reasonable force when necessary to take an uncooperative individual into custody. What the patrol guide did not allow, however, even when this individual was resisting arrest, was the use of a prohibited chokehold. As you know, a number of external authorities have asked many of the same questions we have about this incident. On August 19, 2014, about a month after Mr. Garner's death, the Staten Island District Attorney's Office announced it would impanel a grand jury and present evidence on that matter. On December 3, 2014, those 23 Staten Island residents voted to not indict Officer Pantaleo, clearing him of criminal wrongdoing. That same day, the United States Attorney General announced that the U.S. Department of Justice would conduct its own investigation into Mr. Garner's death and way bringing federal civil rights charges against Officer Pantaleo. In the intervening years, the Justice Department made ongoing requests to the NYPD asking us to delay our internal disciplinary process until its civil rights investigation was complete. And we honored those requests as their process stretched from one administration to the next, with no action by federal prosecutors. And so on July 21st, 2018, we decided to begin NYPD proceedings. Members of the public in general and Mr. Garner's family in particular have grown understandably impatient. The trial began on May 13, 2019. On July 16, 2019, one day before the 5-year statute of limitations expired, the Justice Department announced it would not file federal charges against Officer Pantaleo. Then, on August 2, 2019, with Officer Pantaleo's NYPD trial concluded, Trials Commissioner Maldonado ruled that Officer Pantaleo's use of a prohibited chokehold was reckless and constituted a gross deviation from the standard of conduct established for a New York City police officer. After noting that Officer Pantaleo had admitted he was aware that chokeholds are prohibited by the department, she further concluded, with strongly worded and repeated warnings about the potentially lethal effects of chokeholds found throughout multiple sections of the training materials, it is evident that the department made its 2006 recruits keenly aware of the inherent dangers associated with the application of pressure to the neck. Given this training, a New York City police officer could reasonably be expected to be aware of the potentially lethal effects connected with the use of a prohibited chokehold and be vigilant in eschewing its use. From the start of this process, I was determined to carry out my responsibility as police commissioner unaffected by public opinions demanding one outcome over another. I examined the totality of the circumstances and relied on the facts. And I stand before you today confident that I have reached the correct decision. And that has certainly not made it an easy decision. I served for nearly 34 years as a New York City cop before becoming police commissioner. I can tell you that had I been in Officer Pantaleo's situation, I may have made similar mistakes. And had I made those mistakes, I would have wished I had used the arrival of backup officers to give the situation more time to make that arrest. And I would have wished that I had released my grip before it became a chokehold. Every time I watch that video, I say to myself, as probably all of you do, to Mr. Garner, don't do it. Comply. To Officer Pantaleo, don't do it. I said that about the decisions made by both Officer Pantaleo and Mr. Garner. But none of us can take back our decisions, most especially when they lead to the death of another human being. I was not in Officer Pantaleo's situation that day. I was chief of patrol, and later that year, chief of department. In that position, I proposed our neighborhood policing model so that the same cops would be in the same neighborhoods every day, so that relationships would replace preconceptions, so that problem solving and prevention would become tools officers were trained in and supported in using. And therefore, one of the great challenges of the police profession here in New York City and elsewhere will always remain arresting someone who intends to resist that arrest. Communication and de-escalation techniques are employed where possible, but more often than the police and the public alike would prefer, varying levels of force are used to ensure compliance. Society gives our police the legal authority to use acceptable levels of force when necessary, because police cannot otherwise do their job. Every day in New York, people receive summonses or are arrested by officers without any physical force being used. But some people choose to verbally and/or physically resist the enforcement action lawfully being taken against them. Those situations are unpredictable and dangerous to everyone involved. The street is never the right place to argue the appropriateness of an arrest. That is what our courts are for. Being a police officer is one of the hardest jobs in the world. That is not a statement to elicit sympathy from those we served. It's a fact. Cops have to make choices, sometimes very quickly, every single day. Some are split-second, life-and-death choices. Oftentimes, they are choices that will be thoroughly and repeatedly examined by those with much more time to think about them than the police officer had. And those decisions are scrutinized and second-guessed, both fairly and unfairly. No one believes that Officer Pantaleo got out of bed on July 17, 2014, thinking he would make choices and take actions during an otherwise routine arrest that would lead to another person's death. But an officer's choices and actions, even made under extreme pressure, matter. It is unlikely that Mr. Garner thought he was in such poor health that a brief struggle with the police would cause his death. He should have decided against resisting arrest, but a man with a family lost his life, and that is an irreversible tragedy. And a hardworking police officer with a family, a man who took this job to do good, to make a difference in his home community, has now lost his chosen career. And that is a different kind of tragedy. In this case, the unintended consequence of Mr. Garner's death must have a consequence of its own. Therefore, I agree with the Deputy Commissioner of Trials' legal findings and recommendations. It is clear that Daniel Panteleo can no longer effectively serve as a New York City police officer. In carrying out the court's verdict in this case, I take no pleasure. I know that many will disagree with this decision, and that is their right. There are absolutely no victors here today. Not the Garner family, not the community at large, and certainly not the courageous men and women of the police department who put their own lives on the line every single day in service and to the people of this great city. Today is a day of reckoning, but can also be a day of reconciliation. We must move forward together as one city, determined to secure safety for all New Yorkers, and safety for every police officer working daily to protect all of us. I'll now take your questions.
Commissioner, even though you had Rosemary Maldonado's decision from a couple of weeks ago, you touched on this. The decision, as you said, was very difficult. And if you could address the rumors that have been running around for the last couple of days, that it was so difficult that you had decided that you would rather leave the department rather than make this decision today. Completely untrue.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about rumors. Let's talk about the decision that Rosemary made, the decision that was affirmed by Deputy Commissioner Tucker, and the decision I just made you today.
How difficult then was it for you?
It's an extremely difficult decision.
When did you actually make this decision? Was this up to the wire, or had you made this decision a couple of days ago?
Hey, Mark, I think you know me long enough by now that this was not an easy decision. It's not something that I could make over a few hours. You know, I've been thinking about this since the day I was sworn in as police commissioner. So it's the decision was made in the last couple of days. Tony?
Commissioner, has any determination been made about any pension rights or benefits?
Yeah, he's being terminated. So whatever contributions he made to the pension system, he'll get back. Marcia, hold on.
I know this is a really hard decision for you. I also know that Pat Lynch has said that if you made the decision that you made, you could lose the support of the rank and file. And I wonder, I know you just talked about reconciliation. Are you worried about losing the support of the rank and file, and what do you say to them to make them understand why you had to make this decision?
So immediately, I'm sending out my remarks and the video of this press conference so they know what you all know. And I've been a cop a long time. And if I was still a cop, I'd probably be mad at me. I would. You're not looking out for us. But I am. It's my responsibility as police commissioner to look out for the city and certainly to look out for the New York City police officers. They took this job to make a difference. And you all know the city's been transformed. I've had a lot of help, but it's the cops out there right now and the thousands that have come before us that continue to make this city safe. Some will be angry, and I have a great executive staff. These police officers do a terrific job each and every day, and we'll have to work through this. It's a resilient organization.
So are you asking them to understand that you did this because you believe in the police department?
I did this based on the evidence and testimony at the trial.
Commissioner, our understanding is that negotiations went back and forth Friday and Saturday, and that at one point you were either told or instructed by City Hall that things had to go a certain way. Can you
No, that's not. This is my decision. There are a couple possible outcomes, but this is the decision that the police commissioner makes. This is a disciplinary case, like other disciplinary cases, and it's my decision. Rocco, I'm going to get to you in a second. Hold on. Rocco.
Did you follow the trial day by day, or did you wait till the end of the trial? And then you talk about what you reviewed.
Yeah, no, I did not follow the trial day to day. I waited for the testimony to come up and the evidence to come up. I have a staff that works for me up in my office. They do disciplinary cases. They reviewed it. We got the Rosemary's decision. We looked at that, and we moved forward. Right here, the blonde hair.
Have you spoken to the Garner family?
I have not. Commissioner Tucker has attempted to reach out to them. A couple of different phone calls. Didn't happen too long ago. We're waiting for a call back. All the way in the corner over there.
Have you spoken to Officer Pantaleo yourself, you or your office, or is this the first time he's hearing the news?
No, this is the first time. The announcement was from here. What's that? I talked with Mayor de Blasio about process and possible outcomes.
Commissioner.
Ashley.
Commissioner, in her decision, Judge Nato indicated that Pantaleo was untruthful, and she also raised questions about the credibility of other officers who were not obviously on trial in this case. Can you speak about that conduct and how you felt reading that?
So this whole situation transpired in seconds. I'm sure no one in this room, if they were involved in, no one in this room probably had to, except the police, had to arrest anybody in a physical struggle. And if they could recount step for step what they did, I think that would be nothing short of a miracle. This is the decision Rosemary made. This was affirmed by the first deputy commissioner. I'm agreeing with that. Yes.
Sir, just to be clear, are you making this decision to agree with the judge, or are you making this decision because you believe it is also the right decision?
There's a department trial. There's a process. Rosemary made the decision, again, affirmed by Ben Tucker, and I agree with both of their findings.
Commissioner,
Yep.
you spoke about wishing that Eric Garner wouldn't have resisted and would have just complied. You also said you wish that Officer Pantaleo would have waited for backup. So what is the lesson for your officers coming out of this decision?
So immediately after this, back in 2014, Ben Tucker was the deputy commissioner of training still at the time. We put all of our police officers through a 3-day course, including de-escalation. We've done a lot of other things that we've done fair and impartial policing, and every police officer is wearing a body-worn camera now. There's a lot of things that came out of this incident, and every time there's an incident that affects the NYPD, there's always something to learn. Right behind you. Yep.
Commissioner, you pointed out at the beginning of your remarks about Officer Pantaleo's good record as a police officer, but he was also being monitored for CCRB complaints for using use of force. How do you square those two things? Is the monitoring working, or should we have been under tighter?
His Officer Pantaleo had 289 arrests. As far as we can tell, searching through all the records, no other person that he arrested was injured. He did have a number of resisting arrests, which is not unusual. He had some CCRBs. The one that where he was at, where it was substantiated, that was a bad stop, not use of force. So all this has to be taken in its totality. Out of that 289 arrests, there were a number of gun arrests. And what does the NYPD do each and every day? We try to reduce gun violence in this city. So that I have to look at his record. That's part of the disciplinary system. Yep.
Did the impact of the decision not to discipline Officer Pantaleo, impact on the community, have any factor in your decision making in this?
So I'm not going to stand up here and say I didn't think about that, but I had to be guided by the facts that were brought out in the department trial and that was sent up to our office. I see a lot of journalists here that went through 2014, the protest, the murder of Wenjian Liu and Rafael Ramos, to say that that's never out of my mind. I think about that every day, whether there's a department trial or not. So I can't stand up here and say I didn't think about that, but that's not how I made my final decision. Hold on, right here.
Mayor de Blasio promised that the Garner family would get justice in this case. In explaining your decision, you referred more to the legal standards abiding by the judge's decision. Do you personally believe that this outcome constitutes justice?
This is the outcome of our trial. We needed it to be fair and impartial, and it was a fair and impartial trial. Right here with the glasses.
I know you haven't spoken to the family of Mr. Garner yet, but what would you say to them right now? From day one, we said that there was going to be a fair and impartial trial, and this is the result. Make no mistake about it. This is a tragedy for the Garner family. I fully understand that. Mr. Garner was somebody's son, somebody's dad. Everybody in the NYPD understands that. Right here.
A couple of questions. First, when is this termination effective? Is it immediate?
It's an immediate termination.
And second, reading Judge Maldonado's decision, was there anything in it that you disagreed with?
I agreed with the content of her decision. Hold on, who didn't go yet? Right here. Yep.
Commissioner, during the departmental trial, it came out that a lot of the partner, Justice Amigo, had trumped up charges on an official form for Eric Garner's arrest. Did any part of the other people who testified come to you to say maybe they should be brought up on internal charges?
Right after this, Joe Resnick's people from Internal Affairs looked at each officer that was involved in this. There was a number of civilian witnesses, a number of police officer witnesses, and it was Sergeant Adonis received charges and Officer Pantaleo. Aaron.
Commissioner, you spoke a bit about your time as a beat cop. Did you approach this then from a position of almost reluctance to want to dismiss Officer Pantaleo or empathy? Can you describe your internal deliberation?
So I can't remove myself from the fact that I was a uniformed cop for 34 years. And I think that's what makes this so difficult, that every member of law enforcement in this country that works and keeps this country safe and the city safe looked at that and said, that could possibly be me. And it's in my DNA. It's who I am. But as police commissioner, I have to think about the city, and I have to think about the rules and regs of the NYPD and make sure that people follow them. In the back.
Being a cop's cop, was your biggest concern that this decision, the effect of it would have on your... Being a cop's cop, what's your biggest concern that the department feel be affected by this decision?
I think I stated that. I said if I was still a police officer, I would probably not be happy. But we've been through a lot of things in the NYPD, and it's great history. I know that men and women that do this job are resilient. If somebody calls for help, dials 911, somebody flags them down, they're not going to think about this decision. They're going to think about why they took this job, and they're going to help that person no matter who they are. right here.
Before you announced your decision, you said you were confident this was the right one. Was there something in particular? Was there a moment when you realized that? And what do you see as commissioner that the officer on the street who might be upset with the decision doesn't see?
So, as I said, I went through the testimony, looked at the video a number of times. I know what the definition of a chokehold is. This is what led me to this decision. And again, a difficult decision. In the back.
Can Pantaleo appeal this decision of yours?
It can, under the civil service law, it can use, I think it's Article 78. We'll get the DCLM to give you a further explanation of what that process is after the press conference.
Commissioner, was separation of services one of the possible outcomes in which Pantaleo could have kept his pension as well, and how close were you to embracing that?
So there were a number of different outcomes. You can see based on the charges, he could have been found not guilty of both. He was found guilty of one. Could have been given a vested interest, or he could have been terminated.
But specifically separation of services, which would have been more amenable to him keeping his pension. Were you close to that decision?
It's something that I had to consider, but that wasn't part of my final decision. Yep, right here.
You said earlier that this presser is the first time Officer Pantaleo was hearing of his firing. Do you have plans to speak with him?
Probably not, no. Yep, right here.
Said Daniel Panteleo can appeal this decision, but say another police commissioner comes in the next few weeks or months, can he overturn your decision?
No, this is a final decision. Can't be overturned. Hold on 1 second. Let me see. Marcia, back to you.
I just wondered if the fact that Daniel Panteleo did not testify during the Department of Child played any role in
I can't speculate on that. Rocco, you had a question?
Where is the department at right now, as far as you see? The union obviously will complain in about an hour about this. They've spoken in recent weeks about the issues.
You know, right. This is a big day in the police department, and I'm sure most, if not all, are paying attention to this. And as I said, we take this job to do good, and I'm sure that the police officers that raised their right hand and swore an oath will continue to do their jobs. Yep. Tony.
Yeah. We talked about this earlier. You said that there was a second microsecond for this event to unfold. There was a question about the untruthfulness of Officer Pantaleo's testimony or recollection in proceedings or interviews. Are you of the opinion that he didn't in fact lie, but there was a swirl of the combat, the emotion of the time that he really didn't have the proper recollection?
Yeah, as I stated before, I'm affirming Judge Maldonado's decision. Lenny?
Why wouldn't you let him resign immediately?
So there's no one's asked me this yet, so I'll just throw it out here. What have we learned from this case? What I learned is that we wouldn't let this linger for 5 years. It's too long. It's unfair to the family. It's unfair to everybody involved in this case. Yep.
Last question.
What would those changes look like so that it doesn't take 5 years?
Well, it depends on what the situation is. Now, we would probably have more forceful discussions with the other agencies that are investigating this to make sure that we can proceed with our administrative charges. I think we have over here. Yep. Mark?
I know you came to this decision on your own, but can you speak a little bit about any pressure from the mayor's office and how, whether if that was a factor in this at all?
I have to do what's first. I have to look at Rosemarie's decision. I have to look at Ben's affirmation and be guided by that. Now there's pressure on any number of sides here to make this decision, make that decision. I had to do in the end what I felt was the correct decision. Anybody else?
I'm just wondering, you talked a little bit about the delay in this case, which the mayor and others have attributed to the Department of Justice's investigation taking so long. Do you regret deferring to them for so long until last year?
Regret is probably too strong a word, but it definitely makes me rethink going forward. How would we proceed with administrative trials? Yep.
Now that Officer Pantaleo's disciplinary trial is over, do you have an idea of when you plan to schedule Sergeant Kiziodonis' disciplinary trial?
Yeah, we're in the process of finalizing that.
This year, next year?
Yeah, it's going to be, it'll be soon. It'll be this year.
What's the holdup?
It's a disciplinary case. We have to make sure that we look at all the facts. We have to make sure we have conduct a thorough investigation, and then we move forward.
Have there been any changes to training in light of all of this that's happened?
Say that again, Marcia.
Any changes to training?
Yeah, we did immediately followed. We did de-escalation training. Right.
Leslie.
All right, hold on, right here, and then you have one. Okay, and then that's it. Yep.
You talked about how you think the Garner family would feel about all this. You talked about the pressure from the police department. What do you want the residents of New York City to take from this and your decisions?
So what I want the residents of New York City to take from this, that there is accountability within the New York City Police Department. It is fair and impartial. But I also want them to take account what happens every day in this city and take a look back 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Don't judge us on one incident. Judge us on the totality of what we do, the totality of how you're treated by the police, and how it's evolved. And think about what it was like in 1990. And think about how it's changed and why it's changed. Somebody said, was this a hard decision for you to make? And I said, yeah, but it certainly wasn't the most difficult thing I had to do as a police officer. The most difficult thing I've ever had to do was tell Lisa Tizzulo her husband was dead. Was to tell Jenny Miosotis that her mom was dead. To tell Leanne Simonson that her husband was dead. This is a very difficult job. We get pulled from all sides. We do our best. We recruit from the human race. We're not perfect. But next time you're walking down the street and you feel safe, thank the NYPD. All right, thank you very much.
Watching an announcement from Police Commissioner James O'Neill about NYPD officer Daniel Panteleo. Commissioner O'Neill has decided to fire Daniel Panteleo for using in the arrest of Eric Garner on Staten Island back in 2014. Now, this is an immediate termination from the force. O'Neill said the officer's recklessness caused internal bruising and pain that was a significant factor in triggering an asthma attack. He also said a police officer should reasonably be aware of the effects of the banned chokehold, and he noted that these situations can often be unpredictable for police officers, but that de-escalation tactics should be used when necessary. Now, O'Neill said Pantaleo did not wake up and decide to do this, but he cannot continue to serve as a New York City police officer. And this decision follows Officer Pantaleo's departmental trial and comes more than 5 years after Eric Garner's death. Now, the commissioner's decision follows along with the NYPD trial judge's recommendation to fire Pantaleo, and we will continue to follow this story and bring you any and all updates right here on CBSN New York.